bienvenue dans le panel présenté par le Centre d'études et politique internationale, l'ambassade royale de Norvège à Ottawa, et le Centre de recherche et d'enseignement sur le droit de la personne. My name is Marina Pavlovich. I'm a law professor at the University of Ottawa, and it is my great pleasure to welcome our distinguished panel, His Excellency Ambassador Vollebeck, Professor John Packer, and Professor and journalist Andrew Cohen, who will engage in a discussion on challenges facing ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities in Europe and their impact on domestic and foreign policy. We would like to leave ample time for questions, so the presentations will be relatively brief. Before we begin, I would also like to briefly introduce our panelists, because if I start reading their full bios, it's going to take us a half a day. Ambassador Vollebeck is a distinguished Norwegian diplomat and politician. As of September 2013, he has been a commissioner of the International Commission on Missing Persons. From 2007 to 2013, Ambassador Vollebeck served as the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities. Immediately preceding this position, he served as Norwegian ambassador to the United States between 2001 and 2007, and was also Foreign Minister of Norway from 1997 to 2000. His diplomatic career also included assignments to New Delhi, Madrid, and Harare, and he was also Ambassador of Norway to Costa Rica. He served as deputy co-chairman of the International Conference of the Former Yugoslavia in 1993, chairman of the Council of the Baltic States in 1999 to 2000, and chairman of the Barents Euro-Arctic Council in 1997 to 1998. He also served as an Assistant Secretary General at the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as the Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Norway. John Packer is an Associate Professor of Law and Director of the Human Rights Research and Education Center here at the University of Ottawa, just across the street in the Law School building. Prior to coming to us at the beginning of this year, Professor Packer was the Director of the Human Rights Center at the University of Essex in England, and also had an academic appointment at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. He has held fellowships at the University of Cambridge and Harvard, and lectured at universities and professional institutions around the world. He has been widely published and contributed to the editing of a number of scholarly journals. He also serves on the boards of a number of NGOs and is a member of the expert advisory panel of the Shared Societies projects of the Club de Madrid, comprising almost 100 former heads of state and government of democracies. He's also an experienced practitioner, with over 20 years of experience working on various intergovernmental organizations, including the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the International Labour Organization, and the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. From 1995 to 2004, he was Senior Legal Advisor and then the first Director of the Office of the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities. For the last 2 years, Professor Packer has been a constitutions and process design expert on the United Nations standby team of mediation experts attached to the Department of Political Affairs, advising in numerous peace processes and political transitions around the world, focusing on conflict prevention and dispute resolution, diversity management, constitutional and legal reform, and the protection of human rights, including minorities. Andrew Cohen is a journalist, author, and a professor of journalism and international affairs at the Carleton University, just across town, and has been a visiting fellow at the University of Cambridge. He has recently returned from a year at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. In his career as a journalist of 30 years, he has worked at home and abroad for the Ottawa Citizen, United Press International, Time, the Financial Post, Saturday Night, and the Globe and Mail, where he was a member of the editorial board, a columnist and foreign correspondent in Washington. He has won 2 National Newspaper Awards, 3 National Magazine Awards, and the Queen's Jubilee Medal. He has written and co-edited 5 books, among them The Unfinished Canadian, The People We Are, and The While Canada Slept, How We Lost Our Place in the World, a national bestseller and a finalist for the Governor-General Literary Award for Nonfiction. His most recent book is Extraordinary Canadians, Lester B. Pearson. So Ambassador Vollebeck will provide main remarks, followed by comments from John Packer and then Andrew Cohen, after which we will move to questions and answers, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, which was not that brief after all. It's very it's very nice to be at the University of Ottawa. I don't know the University of Ottawa very well, but we had last year quite good cooperation with the university through your President Alan Rock when we celebrated the 15th anniversary of the Human Security Network in Norway at the University of Bergen, and the University of Ottawa then was one of the main contributors and participants. So I'm very happy to be here also in that context. And then it's particularly nice to see John Packer, who, in addition, as you said, to be the first director at the office of the OSCE High Commission on National Minorities, also contributed quite extensively during my period to many of the recommendations and the work that I did as High Commissioner on National Minorities. So it's great to be here. So thank you for the invitation. In about 3 days, we will celebrate the 25th anniversary of the collapse of the Berlin Wall. On November 9 and 10 in 1989, I happened to be in Brussels for my first visit to NATO as a very new Norwegian Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. When I came to the office of Secretary General Manfred Werner in the morning of November 10th, I found the former German Minister of Defense, and who actually was looked upon as a very strong person, with tears in his eyes. He had been watching TV the whole night and was visibly moved and excited by the new area he imagined Europe was heading for. Those were tears of joy. Before his term as Secretary General ended in 1994, he would have shed many tears of sorrow. It took less than 2 years after that day in Brussels till we saw the outbreak of the violent wars in the Balkans that led to the loss of 40,000 lives. The dream of a new peaceful era for Europe, where countries and people cooperated towards a better future for all its inhabitants, was smashed in inter-ethnic violence. Ethnicity had not been a topic for discussion in European politics since World War II, or it had been a topic Europeans feared and thus avoided. The abuse of ethnicity by the Nazis to promote the so-called Aryans and destroy Jews and Gypsies or Roma had as its consequence that many countries in Europe, including my own, prohibited questions about ethnicity in the censuses after World War II. However, not asking a question does not mean that the question does not exist. The early 90s taught us that placing a lid on a kettle does not mean that it cannot boil over if the temperature is too high or the lid is removed. In Yugoslavia, the lid had been removed by the death of Tito in 1980, and the ethnic simmering started and resulted in a ferocious war by the early 90s. Tito had been clever in managing ethnic groups and possible conflicts through a carrot and stick policy. With his shrewdness and dictatorial control gone, it became clear that the problems had been managed but not solved, and the tension came to surface in disastrous conflicts. This was no doubt a hard wake-up call for European leaders. The way the conflict emerged was new. No declarations of war, no big armies assembling for attacks. To the contrary, neighbors who had been living side by side for decades took up arms against each other. These were very local conflicts, then spread to the national level and across borders to regional level. Inter-ethnic tension going back to the 14th century was anything but forgotten. In 1993, as you mentioned, I was appointed deputy co-chairman of what was then called the International Conference on the Former Yugoslavia, which was a joint United Nations European Union organization to deal with negotiations between the warring parties in the Balkans. And I became responsible for the negotiations between the government of Croatia and the so-called Republic of Serb Krajina, a part of Croatia that claimed its independence in 1991. As I strived to have the two sides stop fighting and reach a sustainable peace agreement, stories about ethnic suppression and ethnic supremacy popped up all the time as explanations for the conflict. The atrocities committed by the Croat Ustaša regime against Serbs during World War II were not at all forgotten. There had been no process of justice and reconciliation after the war. To the contrary, the Serb population in the Croat part of Yugoslavia continued to be discriminated against. In 1991, they saw a chance to make up for it. It was time for revenge. In 1992, European leaders took the bold step to establish the position of OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities, or the CSE at that time. The Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe had not yet become an organization, but for all practical purposes, it's the same institution now than then. This is an autonomous body within the OSCE family. I held this position, as you also mentioned, for the period 2007 to 2013, and John Packer then had been the director earlier, and also then a great contributor to the work that we did also during my time. In the midst of the wars in the Balkans, then in 1992, and these wars actually came, as you will recall, as a surprise to many. And in the midst of this situation, European leaders decided to make an honest effort to deal with possible inter-ethnic conflicts before they exploded. The High Commissioner is a conflict prevention instrument. It is part of OSCE's political military dimension. The High Commissioner can, on his own judgment, decide if a country needs his or her intervention. Over the more than 20 years that the OSCE High Commissioner has existed, the High Commissioner has been engaged in inter-ethnic relations and tension in many of the OSCE 57 participating states. The Balkans was an obvious region to address. However, the collapse of the Soviet Union created a number of new states with a patchwork of ethnic groups, many of them suppressed for decades, and with no institutions to deal with the potential conflicts. In Europe, I find it difficult to have an informed public discussion about the differences between assimilation and integration. As you here will know, the distinction is not without consequences. It is important to try and make clear that assimilation, a policy by which all inhabitants have to fit into one mold, does not work. It creates resentment and alienation. As a consequence, it is important to try to find mechanisms to create a system by which all inhabitants in a country see themselves as accepted and have some kind of ownership to the country. Integration with respect for diversity, which was the slogan of my office. I don't know if you invented it, but anyway, it's a good one, that's true. But it became more than a slogan, actually, for the OSCE High Commissioner. It became both a vision and a working method. The Balkans had taught us a lesson that discrimination and exclusion do create tension and conflict. Thus, it became important to tackle the situation, for instance, in the Baltic states, where the Russians went from being a part of a majority in the former Soviet Union to become a hated minority in the new nation states. In the Baltics, the High Commissioner engaged in efforts to include the ethnic Russians through means of education, participation in public life, media, etc. The same approach was tried in the Caucasus and in the Central Asian republics. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, a number of new states emerged. Nation building often meant strengthening and promoting one ethnic group as the owner of the state or the nation and excluding others. One language, one culture, one religion, as well as one ethnic group were given privileges, while others were marginalized. We knew this would lead to conflict, and the OSCE has for the past 20+ years been actively involved in creating conditions for constructive inter-ethnic engagement in a number of countries. Multiculturalism is, I suppose, a very Canadian concept. I believe it was even coined in this country. These days it is controversial, not least in Europe. Political leaders stand up and announce the death of multiculturalism. And in academic circles, and maybe at this university, you may have even heated debates about the differences between multiculturalism and pluralism. I myself, I'm a practitioner, and I shall not participate in that debate. For me, or from my perspective, all countries today are multicultural, in the meaning that the inhabitants have different ethnic, cultural, and religious identities, because either borders have changed and people may have moved from being majority in one country to becoming a part of a minority in another, or because they are immigrants. In view of Europe's recent history, I am concerned with some politicians' crusade against multiculturalism. It is not an academic debate between proponents of multiculturalism or pluralism. It is, I'm afraid, rather a pitch for old-fashioned assimilation. Europe is going backwards. Politicians preach that the minorities in our societies have to adapt to the majority in order to be accepted. This approach is particularly aimed at new immigrants from non-European countries. It has been exacerbated through the fear of Islam as alien to Europe and against our values. It becomes hard to distinguish between a Muslim and an extremist. Politicians are not good at nuances, and I have been a politician, so I can say that. And the rhetoric of today feeds into all the stereotypes we already have about the other. But the assimilation approach is also aimed at traditional minorities, like the Roma or Gypsies, which continues to be discriminated against through lack of education and inclusion in ordinary life. I believe that many of the arguments in today's Europe against multiculturalism are arguments against monoculturalism. In many European countries, no real integration is taking place. Many immigrants and their children may be looked upon as newcomers and alien to a society, even if they have lived in the country for several generations and are citizens of the country. This creates walls between the different groups and gives reason for frustration and growing tension. The attitude is dangerous because it supports the perception that some inhabitants really do not belong in the society where they live. These days, there are numerous stories told about how marginalization and discrimination lead to extremism. Despite all this knowledge, politicians play with fire and feed into nationalistic and xenophobic tendencies in order to gain support and win elections. Nationalistic parties seem to strengthen their position in the European landscape, and we may ask if we have learned anything at all from our very recent history. Some will claim that the financial crisis is the reason for this growing nationalism. No doubt, the economic crisis in Europe has exacerbated the attitudes. However, the crisis is not the real reason. We find similar attitudes in countries with no major financial problems. I believe globalization is part of the problem. Europeans suffer from agoraphobia these days, the fear of the open room. Everything is open. Their jobs are under threat, their society is changing, the culture and religion are being challenged. Instead of declaring that multiculturalism is dead and has not worked, it is urgent that politicians accept the fact that all European societies are multi-ethnic and multicultural and multi-religious, and start discussing how do we make these societies stable and sustainable. This is by no means easy, but the exclusionist attitude that seems to prevail may take us down a path recent history should have taught us to avoid. At the same time as we have to warn against discrimination and exclusion against ethnic minorities in European societies, we have to warn against an opposite trend that uses ethnicity to expand national interests. As I see it, today's conflict between Ukraine and Russia is a result of such a policy. Russia does not accept to have lost part of its territory and area of influence and uses its ethnic brothers and sisters in Ukraine to position itself. Last year, the Russian Chief of General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, published an article on what he called the hybrid war that is coming, and which he suggested Russia should take advantage of. In the article, he points to the fact that wars no longer are declared and that the borders between peace and war have been blurred. He proposes the use of non-military means to achieve political and strategic goals and claims that these means may be more effective than weapons. The general particularly proposes to appeal to the protest potential in the local population in Russia's neighboring states. It is interesting and worrisome that this strategy seems to be presented as a normal foreign policy approach. We have to remember that Russia already used this strategy in Georgia in 2008. The reaction from the West was quite limited and timid, and might have given Russia reason to believe that similar actions could be repeated in Ukraine, both in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, and may be used in more neighboring countries without major consequences for Russia itself. However, Russia is not the only country that follows this strategy in Europe these days. Hungary has for some years claimed that the Trianon Treaty of 1920, which reduced the territory of Hungary to the present-day republic, has been unjust and left millions of ethnic Hungarians so-called homeless because they became citizens of neighboring states. Recent policy offering citizenship to ethnic Hungarians all over the world, including those who already are citizens of the neighboring countries like Slovakia and Romania, without consulting with the governments of these countries, have created suspicion and tension. The tendency seems to be contagious. Romania claims to have ethnic brothers and sisters in Serbia that they need to help, and Bulgaria claims to have kinsmen in other Balkan countries that are part of their sphere of interest, regardless of their citizenship. Ethnicity is coming back as a danger weapon in European politics. If it is not contained and dealt with soon, it may come out of control and create havoc. The OSCE High Commission on National Minorities has elaborated and issued a number of guidelines and recommendations to deal with different aspects of ethnic problems in our societies. Because of the policy among certain European leaders to take an expansionist approach and use ethnic kins as a means to gain influence in neighboring countries, the High Commissioner launched what were called the Bolzano-Borsen recommendations on national minorities and interstate relations, presenting a number of practical guidelines to deal with ethnic kins on the other side of the border. Organizations like the OSCE and the Council of Europe make an effort to deal with inter-ethnic issues in today's Europe, addressing both the exclusionist and the expansionist tendencies. Therefore, it is of greatest importance that these multilateral structures continue to receive support from leaders of major Western European countries, and that their credibility is not undermined. The weakening of Europe's multilateral structures may have serious consequences for the stability of the whole region. Today's multi-ethnic challenges require serious efforts, both domestically and regionally, to make sure that we develop inclusive and not exclusive policies. If not, ethnicity may once again be reason for many conflicts in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, for the kind introduction. Let me also just say a word of gratitude both to our partners, the Center for International Policy Studies, and to the Norwegian Embassy and Madam Ambassador present with us today for the cooperation in organizing this meeting. It's of course my particular and deep pleasure to be sitting on a panel with Ambassador Vollerbach, who at one point was actually my ultimate boss when you were the chairman in office, I think 1999 was it? Yes, of the OSCE. But let me just say, I think you've already understood how important the kind of role was, not only formally that Ambassador Vollerbach played, but in terms of his person, and personalities matter, I think especially in days like these, a person of evident wisdom, but also clear conviction. And I think we're lacking that a lot in, maybe even in this country too, some clarity in terms of policies to respond to the kind of challenges that you've just addressed. I don't want to distract, in fact, from what Ambassador Vollerbach has set out, because I think it's so important. So allow me just to focus on a few points. The first is with regard to some of the global tendencies, globalization you mentioned, but I just want to put in some other words. I think that one of the recurrent themes that is affecting the world is the increasing fact of complex interdependence. It's striking to me, in fact, that we face seemingly on numerous levels, for example, now the Ebola crisis, but that's not the first international health crisis. It wasn't too long ago. We had bird flu, we had SARS, and so forth. So this shouldn't be new. But it's not the only kind of crisis. You mentioned, Ambassador, the financial crisis, 2008, the credit crunch, if we remember the phraseology. But before that, there were many others. In fact, many of us might here remember the first Asian contagion in the early 1990s, which was the sudden devaluation of the baht in Thailand, which within 24 hours affected currency valuations around the world and bankrupted all sorts of industries and the ability of states to meet their balance of payments and so forth. So we live in a complex interdependent world. From my perspective, this is a statement of fact. And it's not clear to me that our public policies and our responsible authorities are matching that reality with appropriate policy responses. What we know in terms of this kind of complex interdependence, which also features, for example, increasing migration, integration through advanced technology, is that the classical Westphalian paradigm of the nation state, not only comprised in a 19th century ethno-nation sense, but of a discrete territory and a permanent population, is not actually the reality in which we live anymore. Relations are transfrontier. This is the fact to which the Bolzano-Boson recommendations respond, that we have associations, communities across frontiers, beyond not only territory, but even beyond citizenship. We have co-nationality, we have compatriots, we have co-religion, linguistic communities. If you look, for example, at Polish language and its use across Europe these days, after the dispersal with the enlargement of the European Union of Polish workers across Europe, radio and television and so forth. This is the fact of lived experiences of people. Migration is not going to diminish. We see it everywhere, the demands for it, the compulsion for it, whether it be refugee numbers. We shouldn't forget, the High Commissioner for Refugees, or actually the Office for Refugees at the end of the First World War and then after the Second World War, were both established as short-term responses. 65 years later, they're as big as ever. I don't know what the budget is now of UNHCR, but something like $5 or $6 billion, 5 or 10,000 staff, now 30 to 40 million refugees, internally displaced, increasing statelessness, things we thought we addressed long ago, by the way, and yet they're here with a vengeance. So this kind of complex interdependence is reality, and it poses challenges for us, both conceptually but in terms of the policy responses. A key one, to which Ambassador already referred, is this notion of the other. Who is the other? Who is the other when we have multiple relations with communities and states? When I have, for example, possibly multiple nationality as such, but I share, for example, interests in religious sites, such as the Temple Mount, or we could imagine all sorts of different places which hold meaning for me even outside the territory or the place of my shared co-nationals and so forth. We have to think of ways that enhance safe, secure accessibility so that we can all live with dignity and freedom. And that is a normative foundation for contemporary international relations, universal respect, for example, for human dignity. So now, if the first point is that we live in complex interdependence, one part of that is also the fact of ethnocultural diversity. And I'd be glad to hear Ambassador Bolleback say that the fact is there is no, quote, pure state. I would argue there's no pure nation. In fact, that concept of purity is not only itself fictional, it's obviously hugely problematical. And we've seen this in many cases, the competition for who's the best served, who's the best, when you name it, Norwegian, if I may say. What is the pure identity of a Norwegian? I would invite a discussion here, somewhat problematical. I mentioned Norway because Norway, as you may know or may not know, was, until not too long ago, often cited, together with Japan and one or two other countries, as an example of a pure nation state. But it's not, if I may say. And not only as a result of recent migration, but on a historical basis, the actual composition of I think, uncontested Norwegians is that they have their own diversity. So how we then respond to this raises questions. Do we facilitate the free and enjoyed relationships of people who wish to associate for legitimate purposes, such as maintenance of identity? Or do we construct walls? I'm afraid we're constructing walls now, and quite literally so. There's more walls in Northern Ireland and Belfast today after the Good Friday Agreement. There's more division of the communities than there was before 1998, the Good Friday Agreement. There are walls being constructed as a solution on the Saudi-Yemeni border, 1,000 kilometers long, in, of course, Israel-Palestine, famously, for which we've even had a treatment of the subject at the International Court of Justice and so forth. There's a wall mentality right now, making it more difficult. Our country in Canada, a country of immigration, of migration, now making it more and more difficult
The total reaction of Canada in sympathy with the situation in Syria in terms of admission of refugees is, I believe, 1,200 or 1,300, for which our government accepts responsibility only for 200 or 300, the other 1,000 through our citizens. But the actual number who have come here, I don't think exceeds 200. Out of, what is it now, 4 million refugees in Syria? Where's the solidarity in that? Where's the solution to anything in that? I'm not arguing here for open frontiers and unrestricted access, but it's clear that our responses at the moment are not matching the nature of the challenges in which we live. My third point really picks up on the last subjects that Ambassador Volbeck raised, and specifically in situations such as Eastern Ukraine, Crimea, but they're not new either. And I don't even have to talk about Kosovo or Abkhazia and so forth. We should be watching carefully, I hope you're watching carefully, what's going on in Catalonia today, in Sardinia, in Flanders. I mean, never mind the secession or separation referendum in Scotland, but the list is long. Most disturbingly, this tendency now of dissolution rather than integration. Pronounced just this week, I believe, when Angela Merkel, to my shock, said that she could live with the United Kingdom withdrawing from the European Union. So while we've been living in an era of enlargement, integration on a normative basis, now we're facing the two of the three largest member states of the European Union actually parting ways. And parting ways in not a happy sense, as far as I can tell, in terms of the tendency. So we really have to start to think also about what some of these basic ideas such as self-determination, accommodation of diversity, integration mean in terms of public policy. Now, I would just like to conclude with a few suggestions, not that we have a completely lamentable and sad meeting here today, because I think actually the facts and the tendencies are disheartening, are troubling, and should be very troubling, including in this country. But I think there are ways forward, and I'll suggest two of them. There should be no doubt about the hard lines in normative terms about valuing human dignity on a universal basis, that we should apply that normative foundation to all of our activities under a rule of law, both domestically and internationally. And when we part from that, when we start to challenge, this next year is the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta, but we've now challenged habeas corpus. That's unfathomable that that's in doubt, or that we have challenged presumption of innocence, that we now are facing new star chambers effectively with unrevealed allegations and no ability for transparent justice or due process of law. These should be hard lines in any just society, in any society that values the equal dignity of everyone. So my suggestion would be to pay close attention and scrupulously protect and preserve those long ago won and hard fought for foundational norms of both domestic and international law. My second suggestion is to engage in a constructive way with these challenges, for example, of dissolution, these kind of competing tendencies of globalization that integrates on the one hand, but this effort to seek to preserve, maintain identity that tends towards dissolution. I don't think, for example, that the Catalans have an unjust or illegitimate claim. They're trying to assert something about control over their own destiny, something we're very familiar with in this country in terms of our own history. But what are the means and solutions through which that can be managed in a peaceful way that gives due value and credence to legitimate claims, but also manages an outcome that's not one that hits and binds? My suggestion would be to think in terms of greater cooperation, not dissolution, greater cooperation at the international level. For example, to look at the Fourth Committee of the General Assembly as a recourse, a potential recourse, where in the decolonization process of the 1960s, that's what the world did. We managed a number of those demands and crises in mainly Africa and parts of Asia and so forth through a system of collaboration, of international cooperation according to the UN Charter. And we're not doing it now. Where do groups go to bring a claim? Who do they ask? What do they say? Are they given no choice, unfortunately, in a kind of perverse way, but to contest through force of arms or through kind of extreme measures if they're suppressed domestically, if they're not given opportunities at the international level? My suggestion would be we have a joint and shared interest in creating those spaces and recourses, and there are ideas and there are possibilities, and we have to decide to pursue them. Thank you very much.
Just one time so that you can actually lead and teach your class.
Thank you.
I'll be brief because I had promised the organizers, I've asked them if I could leave at 1 because I do have to teach today. Professor Packer had mentioned the subject we thought we had addressed long ago or something like that. And it's interesting that I should be asked to talk about anti-Semitism in Europe, a subject I think many of us thought had been addressed a long time ago. Let me begin with just a couple of anecdotes. A friend of mine, well-traveled, asked me out of the blue, my having returned from Europe, is it safe to go to Europe? Is it safe to go to Europe, he asked as a Jew. He's a seasoned traveler who spent a lot of time in what we used to call difficult places like India, which were for a Westerner were a little more challenging. But he's a Jew, my friend, and his faith makes him nervous about visiting the continent. Another anecdote, simply on the subject of being Jewish, I went to a funeral last summer of an esteemed diplomat who was buried with Christian rites. He was born a Jew within the reaches of the empire, and that embarrassed him. So he left, went to school in London, stayed in London, and remade himself as a proper English gentleman, and he buried that inconvenient part of his past, which was Jewish, and which, of course, he's entitled to do. My point is that it's never been easy to be a Jew, either then or now. God's chosen people has always struck me as something of a misnomer. And with particular Jewish humor, we always ask, chosen for what? The Inquisition, the pogroms, the Holocaust, just what were we chosen for? It is particularly interesting that this question arises now in 2014. Because there is a feeling, particularly among Jews, I've seen this in Europe and I've seen this in Canada, a feeling that perhaps we've done something wrong, but then again, we're always doing something wrong. In 1964, a popular satirist named Tom Lear, who used to teach at MIT, wonderful, you can hear his music on, you caught up on YouTube, did a send-up or a satire of what he called National Brotherhood Week, and this was in 1965. I won't sing it, but I'll give you just 4 lines. Oh, the Protestants hate the Catholics, and the Catholics hate the Protestants, and the Hindus hate the Muslims, and everybody hates the Jews. It is funny, by the way, you can laugh. It is fashionable and has been fashionable, and is fashionable in too many parts of Europe today to hate the Jews. It is an animus found among the usual suspects, yes, the terrorists, yes, the nihilists, and some of the radical imams, for whom the destruction of the Jews is a primordial impulse passed from generation to generation. But I do think it's now broader than that. It is the hardy perennial growing in the garden of Europe, and it's flowering anew in Hungary, particularly, in Ukraine, as well as in parts of Western Europe. It's thriving there and appearing, I'm sad to say, in Germany, where it was supposed to have disappeared, under the rubric of subjects we dealt with long ago. It is in the Ukraine where it's more complicated. No wonder that immigration to Israel has reached its highest level in 5 years. In the last year in the Israeli calendar, 5774, the one that just ended in October, immigration jumped 28%. Where are they coming from? Well, they're still coming from Russia, where they've been leaving since the refuseniks of the 1970s. Ukraine, where some 4,000 left this year. Hungary and Greece, where the parliamentary political opposition is no longer just the usual right-wing ideologues. Among them are strutting neo-Nazis. Germany, Belgium, I mentioned Germany, Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, Britain, have all seen disturbing incidents of anti-Semitism. It is an international phenomenon. According to the University of Tel Aviv, it rose by 30% in 2012. Now, the figures can vary, and I've often been cautious of Jewish organizations like the Anti-Defamation League in this country, which I think don't always get it right. I've always been, as a journalist, somewhat skeptical about their figures. But there is no denying, from what I have seen in Europe, a new wave, particularly last summer, fed in large part by the events in Gaza, of Jew hating, fanned by economic hardship in Europe, and as I say, the war in Gaza. This is not a comment on that war, it's just how it was received in Europe. The epicenter of antipathy is France, where there are 500,000 Jews. It's the largest community in Europe. And beyond the murders in Toulouse, and I was around Toulouse when that happened, where 3 children and a teacher were killed in a Jewish school in 2012, it is hatred run amok. This is not an exaggeration. There are examples after examples of what is happening in France. Attacks on rabbis and Jewish students, riots in suburban Paris, swastikas on walls of Jewish businesses, vandalism of synagogues and other Jewish businesses, social media awash with invitations to the gas chambers. No wonder the largest number, and so this is borne out in some statistical relevance, the largest number of Jewish immigrants to Israel last year, some 6,000, came from France. The year before, it was 3,800 from France. And no wonder, according to one report, that 40% of the Jews in France said they now hide their Jewishness, like their co-religionists hid their Jewishness of the past. So I'll simply say that in the days of awe, which is the period between Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, Jews understand at that period, it was in October this year, September, they can't hide from God. The question I would ask today is whether our Jews are hiding from themselves. Thank you.
I would like to open it for questions. There is a microphone at the back of the room. If you could just speak in the microphone so that it could get recorded. And because Andrew has to leave, if there are any questions for him, could we please address them first? And then John and Ambassador. Yes. Could you speak in the microphone, please, just so that we could record?
Where is the microphone?
Oh,
Okay, I need to go round. Okay.
please, thank you.
No, I thought it was a roving microphone that would come to me.
Could I just add, while he's getting to the microphone, one small thing. I just came back from Vienna a couple of days ago, and I had that kind of, to me, shocking experience as I boarded the plane. In the front of the line to board in business class was a kind of tough-looking guy, and then I noticed 2 swastikas on his, tattooed on his wrists. In a business class line, getting on Austrian Air.
Was he handling security?
No, he wasn't. Good question. But it struck me of kind of an odd. I mean, it was shocking to me, but it was kind of normalcy. You take away the tattoo, everything else was normal. So somehow this presence of, and I don't know what it reflects, but I mean, this is obviously not a hidden element of a direct reference. It was a pretty strange experience for me.
Well, my comment or question is relating exactly to what you said, Andrew Cohen, the rising anti-Semitism. And I'm German. I live in the UK. And there is no doubt that there is rising anti-Semitism. But I'm not sure whether just focusing on the anti-Semitism is the right approach, whether you should not rather focus on all the anti-Romaism, which is rising even quicker, the anti-Islamism, the hatred of the woman in the burqa, and the violence against anyone who is considered to be, and there we are back at the kind of monocultural society as regarded outside monocultural society. And I would think that anti-Semitism in 2014 cannot really be discussed without the broader view of all the anti-Romaism, Islamism, and whatever else there is. And it's part of this broader rejection, and therefore is historically different from what happened in the past. That's how I would probably regard it. And therefore, if we just tackle anti-Semitism, we are probably missing the problem at the heart of it.
Well, that may well be, and how could I disagree with you in a response that should be more universal than simply the Jews? I just think the Jewish question has been around a long time. I just want to make one, you say you live in Germany, and I do want to make a point quickly about Germany. When I talk about anti-Semitism, I'm not talking about, in Germany particularly, I'm not talking about institutional anti-Semitism, and this is a fundamental difference. Any Jew in Germany today, and Berlin is the home of the fastest growing, is said to be the fastest growing Jewish community in the world. Jews don't register in Berlin for historic reasons, so they don't know exactly how many there are, but it is believed to be that. To give you an example of what it's like to be a Jew in Germany today, and I'm not a German, but I was a Jew in Germany, and to go to a synagogue in Germany, and to go to a synagogue in Germany that was assailed on Kristallnacht, and we're coming to the anniversary of Kristallnacht on November the 9th. To get into that synagogue, one had to run through a corridor of security. There was a small police force outside that synagogue, as there was small constabularies outside Jewish institutions, synagogues, but also Jewish institutions, which would mean community centers, all through Germany. And it struck me as I sat in synagogue, a synagogue which had been not destroyed, but had certainly been damaged on Kristallnacht, that 70 years earlier, the power of the state would have been brought to bear on my not worshiping in that synagogue. And 70 years later, the power of the state was brought to bear so that I could worship in that synagogue. And so, when I comment about anti-Semitism in Germany, I make that distinction because it's important to make that distinction, which isn't to deny currents of anti-Semitism, but it is not institutional. When it becomes institutional in any of these countries, and I do worry about Hungary, where it is entering the national legislature, then I will really be worried. But as of now, it isn't institutional, so I just make that distinction.
My name's Bob Haig. I'm a senior fellow at the University of Ottawa Graduate School. I'm also Canada's former ambassador to Hungary. And I say that because I've been at other events, and I'm certainly not an apologist for Hungary and what's been going on there. I have a question for Ambassador Volbeck, but with regard to what Mr. Cohn just said, when I was there and I left in 2007, the mayor of Budapest was Jewish and had been the mayor for many, many years. There was a Jewish Liberal Party that was part of the coalition, the Socialist Coalition. So the situation in Hungary is in a sense, the elements have been there, but this anti-Semitism that you point to, the extreme right, is something maybe a bit more new than old. It's also part of the European Union, and members have remarked as to, and Norway is not, but what is the European Union doing about this and the values of the European Union? So that takes me to a question to Ambassador Volbeck. You mentioned, again, Hungary in the context of giving citizenship to outlying Hungarians beyond its borders. The Russians are threatening to do the same thing, and that, of course, scares all the countries on its borders, including Estonia and Ukraine. My impression is that the Germans did this years ago during the Cold War, and they gave citizenship, and maybe still do, to Germans that were outside its borders, and I don't think anybody said much about it. And I'm not sure whether, again, in the European Union context, that is something that that is being addressed. And if I could ask one little further remark to you, I did some looking into this question a few years ago about the rise of the extreme right, and I was surprised to see, especially given the fact that my grandfather came from Norway, that Norway had a very active right-wing party that was elected. Now, maybe you can correct me on that, but you see the same thing, I believe, in Sweden and in Holland, countries that we regard as very, very liberal. And again, it's a democratic process, and how do you respond when the electorate chooses people like this in a democratic situation?
Thank you. Mr. Cohen say something first?
No.
Is there any other question for Mr. Cohen before he leaves? So that
Don't make me feel badly about it.
we want to give people the opportunity to talk to you. If not. Okay, if not, then I'll take up your question. But with reference also to what Mr. Cohen just said, I think you're quite right in pointing out the increased anti-Semitism. But I also think that our German friend is right in putting this in a larger context, because of course, the anti-Semitism is maybe even more surprising in view of the Second World War and the supposedly teaching in schools. But it is a tendency, as I tried to say, that is more comprehensive, because it is, we are actually moving in a direction where we use ethnicity both to boost our own position and to marginalize others. And see this as a very, very common trend. And I think Hungary fits into that trend, unfortunately, in a very bad way. You may say that, talking about multiple citizenships, and John Packer is a much greater expert on multiple citizenships than I am. Of course, that's not necessarily wrong. It may be a little bit complicated, but it's not necessarily wrong. And we tried also to address that in those recommendations that we issued, the so-called Bolzano-Boson recommendations with respect to then interethnic or interstate ethnicity and interstate relations. But it's the way you do it. And if you do it in the way that our Hungarian friends have done it, and as the Russians have done with the compatriot law, it becomes then quite aggressive, because it undermines the loyalty of the people in the countries of which they are already citizens. And for instance, our Hungarian friends have also then established what they call this parliament on this regional Hungarian parliament. And of course, my friends in the neighboring states also said to me, what's this? I mean, these people are already members of our national parliaments. Why on earth should they go to Budapest for another parliament? And what issues are they discussing there? And since this is not clear, this is not transparent, it becomes then, the fear is that these are small steps taken to undermine the structure of the country, the borders, the institutions of the country of which these people are citizens. And also then you have then retaliation, like Slovakia. Then I think I'm very impressed with Canada, because Canada ratified the Ottawa Treaty to ban anti-personnel mines before it was signed. And I think that's quite unique in the world. I've never been in a country that has ratified an international convention before they signed it, but Canada did that in 1997. I was very impressed. But I'm also quite impressed with the Slovak way of making or passing through legislation, because at 9:30 in the morning one day, the Hungarian Parliament passed this law then on multiple citizenships, or giving citizenship to ethnic Hungarians. And at 3:30 or maybe 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the Slovak Parliament had passed a law saying that if you obtain the citizenship of another country, you will immediately lose your own citizenship, which is quite quick, I must say. But it shows the consequences of this policy, because it's not an honest policy. It's not that you care necessarily for your citizens, but you are more aiming at controlling yourself, reassessing your position, and reassuring or taking some kind of control of an area that you thought was yours. And this, of course, is the danger with what the Russians are doing today, which we see today a great fear in the Baltic states for the consequences of this. And just the fear may lead to reactions in the countries that also then might actually provoke new reactions. So it's a kind of a spiraling effect, actually, on these law-making or these action-taking by certain countries vis-à-vis their ethnic kins in neighboring states. And this is what actually worries me very much. It's not that, and you asked about the European Union. You said Norway is not a member of the European Union. I think the European Union is very important in today's Europe. And I think if, as you say, Mrs. Merkel said that she will have no problems with the UK withdrawing, I think she's utterly wrong. I think it will create a big problem, not only for Germany, but for the rest of Europe. But I'm also very surprised with the lack of instruments within the European Union for dealing with these issues, like you say yourself, that are, you would think, were fundamental questions of values on which the European Union had been built. When we had the conflicts then between Hungary and Slovakia, for instance, and we also had one between Lithuania and Poland because of ethnic animosity, Brussels was very clear that, pointing to the governments in these 4 countries to come to The Hague, to the OSCE High Commissioner, and use us as an instrument, which is good. I mean, and they did that, which I think was also a good example for international mediation or efforts to solve problems in a peaceful way. But at the same time, I think it is a problem that an institution like the European Union doesn't have created for themselves instruments that can deal with these issues, and I think there is the underlying danger. This is not by coincidence. It's not a lack of bureaucracy, but it's actually a lack of political will to deal with these issues. And if that's the case, then I think it could be quite serious for Europe in the long term.
I'd like to address this issue from a slightly different perspective, which is psychological, social, because what I find really interesting is you've got the human need to be part of a larger community. You know, we have a need to be social, be part of something else, something bigger than just our family. We need to be part of a community, and how we define that community can be in different ways. But so community is important to human beings. But then the flip side of it, which I still have troubles coming to terms with, is that that sense of community can lead to distrust, hate, aggression, even violence towards other communities. So, you know, if you look at it from the psychosocial point of view, you know, is there something basically that we'll never be able to grapple with because of human nature? And, you know, raising it then to the public policy standpoint, you know, there is an interface here because as communities, we have certain kind of values, and then consequently we elect certain types of governments, support types of governments, policies and instruments. So I'd be interested in your views on this.
John can give the final answer. I just do the introduction. I think you're right. I think we need to be part of a community. At least I myself feel it that way. But I'm not certain that that necessarily means that I will have a greater problem with accepting others. I think maybe the insecurity is a greater threat. I mean, if I am safe in my group, in my community, but not believing that this is the only community on earth or the very, very best one, but I may be safe there. I may feel I belong to something, and that gives me some kind of security or assurance. Then I think I'm also more willing and able to open up to others. What I think we see in some countries of Europe today, and in many communities, is this kind of uncertainty. Where do I belong? Where do I belong anywhere? There was a great story actually, or great, I don't know if that's the word, but I mean it was a very, what should I say, it was an important story and a moving story about one young Danish boy who had gone to Syria to fight for ISIL. And then he came back, and the Danes have apparently now established quite good programs in dealing with young people that come back from these wars. And he was from Aarhus, I think one of the major cities in Denmark, and he was of Somali origin. And he was telling about how he was I think second generation. His Danish was perfect, but he was still alienated. And he felt that he didn't belong. I mean, in one way he was Danish, but at the same time he was Somali, and the third he was Muslim. What was his identity? Where did he belong? He didn't belong anywhere. He felt marginalized. And then came along representatives of one of these extremist mosques or groups and said, you belong to us. We can take care of you. We will give you an identity. And he said, oh, all of a sudden I felt that there was somebody embarrassing, or not embarrassing, but embracing. and then he said, this is where I feel that I would like to participate. I want to do something for them because they have received me. And then, of course, he understood that this was wrong, and he came back, and he has now apparently been helpful in addressing this issue to his peers, so to say, other young people in the same situation. And I think we don't need to make necessarily everything blurred. I don't think that. But we have to make sure that politicians don't use ethnicity against other groups or religion or culture or whatever, and say that we have to find ways and means of coexisting, not necessarily loving each other, which I also think is another bad thing. I mean that you should love everyone. I don't love everyone, but I know that I have to coexist with them. I mean, we have to find ways and means of coexisting. That's in my own interest, because otherwise my society falls apart. And I think this is something that should be the message in our societies today, and I don't hear that very much, unfortunately. No, you can tell the truth.
No, that is the truth. I don't have much to let me just suggest a couple of things in response. First of all, I'm not sure, is Benedict Anderson Norwegian? Or he published a book called Imagine Communities. He's Danish. Sorry, okay. Scandinavian.
That's okay. Talking about the stuff, we accept the Danes.
Very good, yeah. So there's a very good book on this called Imagine Communities. And I mean, it's obviously part of human nature that we are, and from a human rights perspective, we tend, and after the Second World War, to prize quite a lot this idea of the individual. But we also know that the individual alone is, in isolation, is death. You know, I mean, we are social beings. We are inescapably social beings, and part of our individual dignity is exactly requires the recognition and the maintenance of these kind of social relations, communities of language, communities of belief, communities of ethno-cultural and other practices, locality, region, and so forth and so on. One of the elements of this is to which degree does the state, Andrew left, but he was talking about institutions, formally prize or penalize, create incentives or disincentives, legitimize or delegitimize these kind of belongings and so forth. There's a terrible tendency of, and that's why we talk about homogenization or you know, which way things are going. But when the state starts to say, for example, they reject not just multiple citizenship, but multiple identities, or they say that only with the purest or the best or whatever, which is institutionalized in terms of education or in terms of the languages of the state, officialized and so forth. This is problematical because people do have multiple identities and do have changing identities. I mean, Canada, we know people come here with, from a certain background and so forth, and over time, in 2 generations, this may have changed. I mean, if we start to recount, my parents were immigrants to this country, but if we, they had 5 children, and if we talk about all the intermarriages and the different languages and the different religions and so forth, then we have a mini, you know, small United Nations in the extended family. And that's wonderful. You know, it's fascinating. And to learn, that's not a problem in the sense of negative. Yes, it has complex elements and so forth. So, but certainly if we were to deny that in policy terms, then you're into substantial problems. The nation-state paradigm, you know, is really, first of all, in historical terms, a curiosity of the last 200 years, basically. I mean, it's not the history of the world, and it's probably not, according to a number of people, the future of the world. If we look at places right now, like Bosnia and Herzegovina, I was there about 10 days ago, trying somehow to keep alive constitutional reform. You know, but Bosnia, I mean, it's become frozen by this nation-state paradigm, which doesn't fit, and is rendering not only impoverishment, but deep dissolution at the social, psychological level, and feeding extremism. I mean, tell you frankly, the mosques and the madrasas are full. The extremist elements, even though the election showed some moderation in some parties, but actually what it showed was a lot of people. They had the largest number ever of ruined votes. I don't know if you saw this. So people just said, we reject the offer, the political offer. That's not healthy for society. So I think that this, if you allow me one other thing to mention about Germany. At the end of the Cold War, Germany did adopt a policy, had a policy of protection and support of Germans abroad. And you might know they prized, actually paid for the Volga Germans. And if anybody they could find, Vladimir Schultz, they gave him a ticket and brought it back. And then they found that actually these people weren't very German, first of all. But it was problematical, and they changed their policy. I forget what year. I don't know if anybody knows. It was about 1996 or 1997. And they started, first of all, supporting actually the communities within which, so they had an interest in the relationship of cultural, for example, affinity of Germans abroad. But they started to invest in the support of communities where Germans lived, not supporting Germans, or not even trying to identify Germans, but supporting German locations where there were German towns. They opened up things, for example, like learning the German language, not just to Germans, but to anybody who wanted to learn, which incidentally was a lesson from the First World War of the Permanent Court of International Justice decisions in terms of national minorities. And they did something else even more important domestically. They changed their own domestic policy to recognize the Roma and Sinti officially as a national minority in Germany. A huge change in terms of policy and who are we, that you could be a real German and Sinti
And that's amazing, because that's not what the Volk implied in historic terms. So I would just say Germany, early on after the post-Cold War, in the post-Cold War period, actually adjusted its policy to make it more sensible, and I think that was laudable.
There is one here.
Yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to add in terms of maybe adding a more positive or encouraging or optimistic view. You know, we're talking about European union and ethnicity and whatnot. But I was struck up, well, a couple of months ago, there was a fellow who came from Taiwan. He came to Carleton to talk about the Asian kind of economic integration strategy and studying the European Union history. And I expected it to be a very technical conversation. But at the end, really it was about the most stark comment I recall is the Asian saying that in Europe, the very software, the very center of the project is reconciliation. Going beyond tragedy and all the suffering that has gone on to build an economic union, but also that the whole architecture is built on reconciliation, whereas that is totally absent in the Asian situation. And underlines the challenges of the Asian environment. So I think there's more hope in a European situation. I enjoyed the ambassador's reference to, in Canada we talk much more about integration versus assimilation. However, our neighbor to the immediate south, they still have on their money e pluribus unum. You know, they have a point of view that 1 + 1 = 1. I think in Canada we have tried to move in 1 + 1 = 2, this so-called multicultural approach. However, there's a lot of discussion in Canada, I would say, in particular in Quebec, that really we want multiculturalism is just like more islands, more kind of mosaics, the words we used to use very much here in Canada. But I think really the new concept is interculturalism, where you're looking for something that's, it's 1 + 1 should = 3. Because you're building something in a cooperative way, something new, occupying new space. You make your own house more comfortable and inclusive, but you're also ready to participate into a more inclusive global world. So I would just make an appeal that moving our own thinking in Canada, beyond multiculturalism to a more interculturalist, where it's 1 + 1 = 3, and maybe even more, if we really, get our act together. So thank you very much.
This could do well in Europe too, so thank you very much. I bring that back.
Michael Kurgan, a senior fellow at the Graduate School and a former colleague of Ambassador Vollebeck in Washington. I have two questions. One is a yes or no answer. The other one's might be a bit more complicated. The first question is picking up on the multicultural remarks by Ambassador Vollebeck and the importance of diversity. Would it be fair to say that a nation state or a country that has greater diversity of ethnic groups would be more likely to have social harmony? That is to say that if you have an immigration policy that tends to welcome people of a wide variety as opposed to an immigration policy or immigration that is really related only to one or two ethnic groups, the chances are for greater disharmony. So that a country might be encouraged for social harmony to ensure that its immigration policies try to cover as many different ethnic groups or diversity as possible. That's the sort of maybe the yes or no question. The more complicated question a little bit is, we've talked a lot about ethnicity, which I would equate perhaps also, you would include racism. Essentially, Andrew talked a little bit about religion, as Jewish as a religion. I would wonder to ask that obviously religion now is causing extraordinary amount of social disharmony and tension amongst groups of people. And I wonder, are there different tools that a society or state might use in dealing with disharmony based on religious grounds as opposed to those that might be on ethnic grounds? Are there distinctions to be drawn in how societies might deal with these two different types of disharmony? Ethnicity, before you take the Bosnia situation, the ethnic groups are very similar. They had different religious backgrounds, which were basically causing a great deal of disharmony. Thank you.
Who's going first?
Well,
Well, with all due respect, Ambassador Kurgan, I don't think your first question is a yes or no question. At least well, maybe you have a yes or no.
No.
But no, it is, because it is, I think, you know, in my previous capacity as High Commissioner, I came to Canada on one visit to learn from Canada. I think you have a lot to learn us. But at the same time, I was also struck by the difference between Canada and Europe. Canada, in spite of the fact that it's now some centuries old, it's a new society. People have come, most of them, then, except your First Nations, have come from abroad to settle, and they have that kind of perspective to settle in a new society. In Europe, of course, you have a lot of history, and people are, if you look at Central Europe, I think the multi-ethnic or the multi-ethnicity is actually more due to changing of borders than people moving. So it's not that I have gone to a place to become a part of that society, but because of a war, or because of a peace treaty, whatever, I happen to be moved from one country to another country. And of course that psychologically is very different. It's a very different approach. So I think, in spite of the fact that we can learn a lot from Canada, and we should, with your tools and your approaches and things like that, I think we have to bring our own European history into it, because otherwise it can't really be used in a proper way. We have to take that perspective. And then it becomes, and then our countries are smaller. So again, I think to a certain extent, your question is, I mean, you will have immigration from a number of countries today in all European countries. You can't really control it to a couple or to a few. And it is complicated for smaller countries because it demands a lot of resources. So if you, and that's why I think it's so important to do this on a long-term basis and not wait for a crisis. Because if you have a crisis, you will not manage it. But you have to have this as a preventive policy, so to say. I mean, your integration policy, your dealing with different ethnic groups is part of your prevention in order to make sure that your society doesn't fall apart. But it's complicated. But I think this is what you should discuss, how to do this, and not whether we like intercultural or multicultural or pluralistic, whatever you call it, society, because they are there. It's really a futile discussion. And we waste a lot of time by discussing this and address how can we really make this viable. Religion, I didn't deal a lot with religion and religious communities in my previous work. It was, even though you may, in some cases, of course, ethnicity and religion are correlated quite a bit, but not necessarily, as John has pointed out several times, we have different identities, and ethnicity and religion and culture may be different. What I unfortunately saw was that it's almost more difficult, and I'm telling that to religious leaders, to deal with religious leaders than with secular leaders. And it is, of course, very difficult to have a discussion when you supposedly discuss with God, because they claim that I am representing God, and God is on my side, and who am I to argue? And I must say I've been very frustrated many times with these discussions, because they feed into ethnicity and xenophobia and nationalism, also with this religious dimension, which makes it even more difficult to overcome or build down barriers, because then it becomes a part of my faith. I may be illoyal to my church, I may be violating God's will, God's word. So the walls become even higher because of the religious component. And I think as much as we have to address political leaders in Europe today and tell them that they are destroying the fabric of Europe by their ethnocentric and xenophobic policy, we need to address religious leaders. Of course, the imams and the Muslim leaders, but not only those, actually, also the Christian leaders in our societies, and I suppose Jewish for that matter, have to be made aware of their role and actually their power, because we haven't become more secular societies. We haven't become more secular maybe on the official level, but if you look at the communities, there is a lot of religion there, which means that actually religious leaders might have more power today than what they had in my youth, if you go 50 years back. And this is something they should be aware of and held accountable and responsible for.
Just a couple of comments. First of all, I too beg your pardon that I can't respond to your first question, yes or no. What I would say, and in an academic setting, is that we need more research. But immediately, just kind of off the top of my head, if I start to think of comparing India versus Norway, and so I don't think actually it gets us very far in terms of policy prescriptions, because there's so much. Ultimately, every situation is quite unique. These kind of problems are recurrent. I would like very much what Ambassador Volvik just said about the difference about how, we mentioned Trianon earlier. The objection of the Hungarians is Trianon was imposed as victor's justice by the victors after the First World War that purposefully carved up Hungary as part of the Hungarian Empire. So obviously no choice over it, but then rendered overnight all these people suddenly aliens in their own, quote, home. So that's obviously problematical. And not what happened here, other than, of course, our First Nations. The other thing I'd like to say is about religion. In 1990, I co-edited a book just immediately after this Cold War was ending on ethnic and linguistic minorities in Europe. Now, where the title came from is that we worked with a number of people in different countries. We had about 15 chapters. At the end of it, we were going to put ethnic, religious, and linguistic, and then we noticed there was actually nothing religious in it. There was no religious groups. It was all ethnic and linguistic, which is really the kind of European paradigm generally, is the nation is a linguistic nation. Norwegians speak Norwegian, if I may say, reduce it that way. Swedes speak Swedish, and so forth. But what we found more recently is this is not the case anymore. So if you talk about Ukraine, for example, it's not just ethnic Russians, ethnic Ukrainians, but for example, the competition between Orthodoxy, Catholicism, the division between the Patriarch in Moscow, and so forth. Even in Kiev itself, I think there's divisions. There's just 6 different groups, and their relationship with property, institutions like schooling and so forth, they're highly integrated. So there's a big competition on of a religious character, for example, which wouldn't have been things where we. What I'd like to say in conclusion on that is I'm very troubled. So first of all, religion is kind of non-negotiable. We can imagine figuring out language arrangements, multiple uses. We can learn the other person's language. That's what we do in Canada, bilingualism, and we teach it. Religion is, I'm not going to negotiate, and I can't. I'm under instruction, especially if it's God's will. We can't make a deal. So religion is problematical more than, I think, language and ethnicity.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. Yes, please.
Oh, I think the lady is. Are you in line?
I was in line.
You were in line.
Sorry.
You're two.
My name's Ebru, and I'm a graduate student at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at Carleton University. My research is focused on the Turkish communities in Vienna. And while I was there last year, the concept of othering was something that I really experienced because if someone would just look at my name, it's a Turkish origin, and I would automatically get classified into that othering group. And so that was something I really struggled with while I was there and also within my research. So my question for you would be, from a local perspective, you're talking a lot about globalization, changing of borders, but when it trickles down to local levels of these groups, what can the groups do to try and overcome the struggle of the othering? Is there anything that they can do to kind of introduce themselves maybe to their host societies, and not just the new migrants either, but the ones who've been there for 3-4 generations now?
No, thank you. It's an important question, and I think because I think we have to take this down to the local level in order to make our society sustainable. And it's an interesting perspective because I think those of us who then deal with these issues from a more outside perspective, we often address the authorities and talk to the authorities and say they should do this or that. The beauty, so to say, of the High Commissioner's mandate, maybe John was part of working it out and carving it out, is that we deal with both sides. We also have to tell minorities that they are actually part of a majority society, and they have to accept that there is a history there, might be a majority language, so you have certain rights and privileges, but you have also certain duties as a part of society. And I think this is something for community leaders also to, within these societies, to address, that in order to be a part of the society, you have to participate. I mean, the government has, of course, or the authorities would have to give opportunities through language training, through, you might even have a quota system, I think, from time to time in certain situations. But then it also has to be accepted and taken up by these communities, that they actually are actively participating. I think in Norway we see both. We see large groups that do not participate, but it's very interesting to see today how second generation immigrants from non-European countries actually are. They take up studies, quite, I mean, prestigious studies in the society, lawyers, doctors, and they become politicians, and they take up positions in public places. And I think this is one of the most important long positive paths that we can have if you look at the long-term perspective, that you find role models, that you find examples of people with either Turkish names, as you say, or other that we would call difficult names or strange names, that actually become prominent persons in our societies, because then it becomes normal, natural. And I think it has to be normalized, if you can use that term, in order to be a fully cohesive and cohesive society.
Yes, please. I just want to express my name is Maureen Korp, and I am a historian of religions, a cultural historian of religions. And I was wondering about the omission, because in the 20th century, beginning with the Treaty of Lausanne, 4 different times men sat down at tables and decided to move populations on the basis of religion. Nobody asked, where those dividing lines should be, but picked up large populations from Turkey to Greece, from Greece to Turkey, Cyprus switching back and forth in the division of India. And this thinking hasn't been fully challenged today. Theocratic states are not good states.
Well, if I may just say that theocratic state for sure is problematic. I would say any kind of dogma and linked with authoritarianism, is all problematical. At the same time, religion is a recurrent element of our species condition. We have religion, we possess religion. It's not going away, and there's a right and a freedom to religion. At least in terms of belief, but also in terms of certain practices. How we reconcile this, I think, is a question. One of the good things about religion in terms of human rights, as one normative framework, is that its accommodation is largely in terms of respect for the freedom in largely so belief in the private sphere, and so the separation from the state. Now, at the same time, Europe has many countries with established religions and with systems of favoritization and preference specifically. Sweden only just established a Lutheran church, 7, 8 years ago, I forget. Does Norway still have?
Had a shift or a change of policy 2 years ago.
So, I mean, this is an evolving situation. And Angela Merkel is the leader of the Christian Democratic Party. I mean, you can't much more officialize kind of religion. So, never mind taxation and so forth. So we have to look at how we actually blend this. I think Andrew was right about institutions and the state and the officialization of it. And it's complex and difficult. A couple of words, if you allow me, on the previous question. I find it, this question about integration, and I share entirely Ambassador Vollebuck's remarks, but it's really a challenge, it's a puzzle of living together. And we have different metaphors, the mosaic, increasingly we talk about the salad bowl, as a mixed and so forth, but not, our neighbors to the south, which have a different metaphor about assimilation and so forth. But you won't live together peacefully, constructively, and prosperously in the absence of knowing your neighbors, having a relationship, which is another level of community, and then engaging, you use the word, Ambassador, taking up
And I think we find healthy societies, we note things like the high degree of mobility, labor markets, intermarriage, how easily that's done, how the transitions. I think those are signs of, tend to coincide with stable, prosperous societies, where this is not present. I thought one thing that was very interesting, I remember France during the World Cup they hosted. Do you remember the whole rainbow team they had? Initially, Monsieur Le Pen, the father of current head of the Front National and leading candidate for presidency, I think, in France right now, shockingly. But her father, who was then the leader of the Front National, actually criticized the French team at that point for not looking French, and they didn't have the right names, right? And in addition, they didn't all sing the Marseillaise, so they couldn't represent. He had to change it when they won, because in the Stade France. But you know, now the last president, not the current, the previous president was a guy named Sarkozy. What a wonderful French name, a Hungarian name. And so I think those are actually good things that we see. Where now, you know, the children after the French won the World Cup, who started to wear shirts with Zinedine Zidane on the name, or Henri. Okay, it's a French name, but in terms of origin of French, West Africa, and so forth. So those are good signs, and I think they give us cause for some encouragement.
Just to pick up on the religion, I think if you look at the Treaty of Lausanne, it was also then not necessarily the religious leaders that did this. These were politicians.
That's what I was trying to
Yeah.
say.
So
Right.
politicians use religion and for their political purposes. And that is a great danger, I think, and we should not be accepted. And some of us then that may feel an affinity for certain religions believe still that religion could actually be a positive tool in this. If you take up some of your, if you look at the human dignity, the value of a person, if you look at some of the principles on many religions of taking care of the other, of the weak, you could actually turn this around. And I think this is the challenge that we should present to our religious leaders. I mean, show the religion from that perspective and not make an abuse of it.
Thank you. I'd like to thank our panel. I think they've given us a lot to think about and even more importantly, a lot to act on. Good job.